Hook. In the far reaches of a fractured galaxy, ex-Commander Kai Mercer rescues a mysterious alien woman, Nira, from the remnants of a brutal regime. But as they drift between stars, hunted by the past, they find themselves entangled in something far greater than survival, hope. What begins as a rescue soon becomes a rebellion against fate itself. Kai Mercer stood in the heart of the Zarthon war camp. Surrounded by the wreckage of war, fires still smoldered in the distance, sending trails of black smoke curling into the twilight sky. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and scorched earth, laced with something sharper, the coppery tang of blood. It was over. If he had won, the Zarthon Dominion had fallen, its warlords surrendering one by one. Kai had fought for this moment, had given everything for it. But now, as he stood before General Rekosh of the Ninth Fang, he realized victory had come with a price he hadn't expected. Rekosh loomed before him, a monstrous figure of muscle and battle-scarred hide. His reptilian face bore the remnants of a once smug arrogance, now dulled by defeat. Behind him, Zarthon soldiers moved in silence, their weapons stacked in surrender. And then there was the girl. The warlord yanked on a length of chain, dragging a small, blue-skinned figure forward. She stumbled, caught herself, and dropped to her knees at Kai's feet. The chain rattled as it pooled beside her. "This is your reward, human," Rekosh rumbled. Kai barely spared a glance downward. He knew what he would see. Another casualty of war. Another life chewed up and spit out by forces beyond her control. But something in the way she held herself caught his attention. She wasn't just kneeling. She was waiting. The collar around her throat pulsed with dull blue light, the telltale glow of control tech. Kai had seen plenty of them before. Prisoner restraints designed to keep captives docile. A press of a button and pain would slice through her nerves like fire. Another press, and her body would seize, her muscles no longer her own. She did not look up. Rekosh tilted his head. "She belonged to us once. Now she belongs to you." Kai's stomach twisted. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "I didn't fight this war for this." The Groxian narrowed his crimson eyes. "No. You fought to end our rule. Well, here is one of our spoils, the last of her kind in our dungeons." He gestured with a clawed hand. "Take her, or end her suffering. It makes no difference to me." His jaw tightened. The woman didn't move, though a faint shudder ran through her shoulders. She expected death. She had already made peace with it. Kai hated that look. He crouched beside her, slow enough not to startle her. Up close, she looked even smaller. Her blue skin, though striking, was marred by bruises. Her silver hair, matted with dirt, clung to her face. He could see the hollowness in her features, the signs of long-term captivity, malnourishment, exhaustion. A quiet detachment that spoke of too many days spent waiting for something worse. His fingers brushed the collar. She flinched. Kai exhaled through his nose and found the release mechanism. The metal was thick, built to last. But Kai had cracked tougher restraints before. With a sharp twist, he forced the collar apart. It sparked once before falling to the ground. The woman inhaled the smallest hitch in her breath. The glow at her throat died. Rekosh watched, unblinking. Kai rose to his feet. "She's coming with me." A low, considering hum rumbled in the warlord's throat. "Interesting." Kai turned, expecting the woman to stay frozen, uncertain. But after a moment she moved, but gracefully, not confidently. But she followed. The camp stretched before them, littered with the debris of war. Zarthon soldiers sat in clusters, their hands bound, their expressions unreadable. Human forces patrolled the perimeter, securing the last of the strongholds. Kai led the way toward his waiting vessel. The woman trailed behind him, silent. She had not spoken a word. Rakash's voice followed them as they walked. Strange creatures. You humans? Kai ignored him. He just kept moving, wondering what the hell he had just done. Kai Mercer had seen plenty of shell-shocked soldiers. Men and women who had fought too long, lost too much, and forgotten how to be people instead of survivors. He'd seen it in the mirror more times than he cared to admit. But this was different. The blue-skinned woman, his former war prize, though the term made his stomach turn, moved through his ship like a ghost. Silent, careful. She made no demands, took up no space, merely breathed loud enough to notice. If Kai hadn't seen her eat, he might have believed she was more specter than flesh and blood. She had spoken once. Just once. Nira. That was the name she had given him. Voice barely louder than a whisper. He had asked no follow-up questions. She had volunteered nothing more. Kai, too tired to deal with the mess he had willingly walked into, had left her to her own devices. He made sure she had food, a bed, clothes that weren't tattered rags. Beyond that, it didn't push. She wasn't some fragile thing he had to handle with care. But she wasn't exactly okay. Either, he just didn't know what the hell to do about it. On the third lunar dusk, he found her sitting at the small mess table, untouched food in front of her. She wasn't staring at the walls, lost in some haunted reverie. No, she was studying the ship's control panels across the room. Gaze sharp, thoughtful. Kai leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, thinking of stealing it. Tsayil startled, her silver eyes snapping to his. She didn't panic, didn't bolt, but she did tense. Kai raised an eyebrow. That was a joke. She blinked once, then turned her attention back to the control panels. I don't know how to fly, she said. Kai had expected silence. The response, however, flat, was progress. Well, that's a relief, he said, moving toward the counter to grab himself a drink. Would been a real shame if I had to fight my own ship back from you. She said nothing, but he caught the barest twitch of her lips. Not a smile, an acknowledgement. Kai pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. He wasn't a man for deep conversations, but he knew how to get people talking. The trick was patience. You didn't pry. You let them want to fill the silence. She stared at him warily. He gestured at her untouched food. She hesitated before answering. I don't eat much. He nodded, sipping his drink. Zarthan rations her garbage. Probably better to starve than eat that crap. Again, that near smile. Gone in a blink. But she picked up the fork and took a small bite. Kai leaned back in his chair. How long were you in their camp? Sale's fingers tightened slightly around the fork. A long time. Voge. But that was expected. He could work with vague. Before that, he asked. She hesitated. He had pushed too fast. Kai sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Look, you don't owe me anything. I'm not expecting some tragic confession. Just figured if we're stuck in the same ship, it might be nice to know something about the person I risked pissing off a Zarthon warlord for. She frowned. Why did you? Kai exhaled. He hadn't really thought about it. Because leaving her there had been unacceptable. Because he had seen too many people treated like disposable assets in this war. because he was tired of watching good people be crushed under the weight of someone else's power. But that wasn't what he said. Instead, he shrugged. Didn't like the alternative. She studied him as if searching for deception. Then she nodded. Just once. Kai took that as a victory. They sat in silence for a while. Not comfortable, but not tense either. Then out of nowhere, she asked, "Where are we going?" Kai smirked. "That depends. You planning to stay?" She looked down at her plate, thoughtful. "I don't know." Kai let the words settle before he responded. "Well, until you do. My ship's as good a place as any." He stood grabbing his empty glass. "Just don't steal it when I'm sleeping." This time there was no mistaking it. Sale's lips curved. The tiniest ghost of a smile. Kai pretended not to notice. Kai Mercer had spent years learning the difference between silence and quiet. Silence was the absence of sound. Empty and lifeless. Quiet, however, had texture. It had weight. It carried the unspoken thoughts of those who filled the space. For 3 lunar cycles, the ship had been filled with silence. Naira moved like a ghost, drifting from one room to the next without a trace. She never made noise unless necessary. She ate when Kai wasn't looking. She flinched at sudden sounds but never startled. She was there but only in the way that shadows were present but never fully part of the world around them. Kai didn't push. He wasn't good at delicate things, and trust wasn't something you could force. He gave her space. Let her find her footing. Let her decide what to do with the freedom she hadn't expected to have. But now, as he leaned against the doorway to the engine bay, arms crossed, he realized something had changed. Naira wasn't just moving through the ship anymore. She was studying it. She stood near the reactor panel, her fingers hovering over an exposed section of wiring, not touching, just observing, eyes flicking over the machinery with a sharp analytical focus. Kai watched her for a moment before speaking. "If you're planning to sell the ship for parts, I'd appreciate a heads up." Naira jerked slightly, but she didn't turn right away. Instead, she exhaled softly, then glanced over her shoulder. Her silver eyes reflected the dim light of the control panels. "I wouldn't strip it for parts," she said. "Too many redundancies in the system. It's more valuable intact." Kai raised an eyebrow. "I was joking." She hesitated, as if processing that information, then turned back to the exposed wiring. Kai stepped closer, peering over her shoulder. "Something wrong with my engine I should know about. You have a coolant flow issue," she said, pointing at a frayed connection. "Its seal is degrading. If it burns out, you won't lose propulsion, but power to secondary systems will be unstable." Kai narrowed his eyes at the connection she was indicating. Now that he looked, he saw it. The wear. The slight corrosion on the edges. "Oh, damn," he muttered. "You're right." She glanced at him, almost wary. "You didn't notice it," Kai smirked. "I tend to ignore problems until they try to kill me." There. Just for a second, a flicker of amusement crossed her face. It was gone as quickly as it had come. But Kai had spent enough time around wary people to know a win when he saw one. He leaned against the wall, arms still crossed. "You an engineer, or just naturally good at pointing out my mistakes?" Naira hesitated before answering. "I used to work on civilian ships, transport vessels, planetary defense systems." Kai nodded slowly. That explained why she recognized ship systems so easily, but it also meant the Zarthans kept you alive because of that, didn't they? Naira didn't move for a moment. Then, with a slow, measured breath, she nodded. "They needed engineers. I was useful." Kai's jaw tightened. He had seen what the Zarthans did to prisoners who were useful. Naira must have noticed his expression because she turned to face him fully. "I don't want to be useless," she said quietly. Kai met her gaze. She wasn't just talking about fixing the ship. He considered his words before answering. You're not. Naira studied his face like she was trying to find a lie in it. When she didn't, she turned back to the control panel. Kai took that as progress. The next star rise, Kai woke to the sound of tools clinking. He threw on a shirt and padded barefoot to the engine bay, stopping short when he saw Naira crouched by an open access panel. Tools scattered around her. She had pulled her silver hair into a loose tie. Sleeves rolled up. Completely absorbed in what she was doing, Kai leaned against the doorway. Do I need to start paying you? Naira didn't flinch this time. She simply continued working, adjusting a connection before answering. Your ship has multiple inefficiencies. I am fixing them. Kai smirked. That bad? Huh. She paused, then glanced up. Yes, Kai chuckled, walking over to peer into the panel. You know, most people would ask permission before messing with someone else's ship. Naira gave him a look that was so close to deadpan that Kai almost laughed. You said I could help. I did. Didn't I? She nodded once and returned to her work. Kai crouched beside her, watching her hands move with practiced precision. The hesitation he had seen before was gone. Here, in front of an engine, she was steady, confident. He reached for a loose wire. Want me to? Don't touch that. Kai froze. Why not? Naira barely looked up. Because you'll do it wrong. Kai let out a bark of laughter. Wow. You go from barely talking to insulting my mechanical skills in one day. That's impressive. Naira didn't smile, but he saw the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth. Kai leaned back against the wall, arms resting on his knees as he watched her work. So what's next? Naira paused. Next, Kai shrugged. Are you planning to stick around, or is this just a pit stop before you figure out where to go? She was silent for a long moment. Then, softly, she said, I don't know. Kai nodded. Not pushing. He tapped the metal floor beside him. Well, until you figure it out, you've got a ship to fix. Naira glanced at him, then at the engine, then back at him. Slowly, she picked up a new tool and got back to work. Kai didn't say anything else. She had just made the choice to stay. Kai Mercer had always found peace in the quiet hum of a ship at rest. Out here, between worlds, there was no war, no orders, no weight of command, just the soft vibration of the hull, the distant stars stretching in endless black, and the steady pulse of life support systems keeping the void at bay. But tonight something felt different. He stood outside on the ship's extended hull platform, a small maintenance deck, just large enough for two. It wasn't meant for stargazing, but Kai had always found himself drawn to it on nights when sleep refused to come. The artificial gravity kept his boots steady, but the rest of the universe felt weightless. He wasn't alone. Naira sat near the edge, her legs folded beneath her, silver hair unbound and catching the faint glow of the distant starlight. He didn't flinch when he stepped closer. That was new. Kai leaned against the railing, arms crossed. I didn't peg you for the type to sit around looking at stars. Naira didn't look away from the view. They used to be my home. Kai stayed silent. He wasn't sure if she was speaking figuratively or literally. Naira exhaled, her breath slow, steady. My people were wanderers. We lived on ships moving between systems, never settling on one world for too long. The void was all I knew. She hesitated, then added, until the war. Kai watched her carefully. She rarely spoke about her past. The pieces she had given him had been scattered, fractured memories of who she was before. But tonight something had shifted. Naira glanced at him. You were born on a planet. Weren't you? Kai nodded. Nova Terra. A long time ago. She tilted her head slightly. Do you miss it? Kai huffed out a quiet laugh. Miss what? The pollution? The bureaucracy. The way people fight over land they don't even remember how to live on. Naira gave him a look. Unimpressed. Kai sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah. I miss it. She nodded as if she understood. The ship was stretched between them. But this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken thoughts. Shared in the space between words. Kai shifted, watching the way Naira traced small patterns on the metal beneath her fingertips. Why did you come out here? Naira hesitated. The ship is safe. Familiar? But space. This is something else. She finally met his gaze. For the first time in years, I can look at the stars and not feel like I'm trapped beneath them. Kai's chest tightened. He had seen her flinch at shadows. He had watched her move through his ship like a prisoner still expecting a cell door to close behind her. But here, now, under an open sky, she looked lighter. Not free. Not yet. But closer. He swallowed the lump in his throat. Yeah, I get that. Nira stood at him, her silver eyes searching his face. You too, Kai, let out a slow breath. I've spent a lot of time fighting. And when you fight long enough, you start thinking it's all you are. But then, one day, you wake up, and the war is over. And you don't know what the hell to do with yourself anymore. Nira didn't look away. Is that why you saved me? Kai blinked. What she turned back to the stars. You could have left me there. Or given me to someone else. Instead, you broke my collar and let me onto your ship. Her voice was quiet, but not uncertain. You didn't know me. So why? Kai exhaled. He could have given her a simple answer. A practical one. Because leaving her there had been wrong. Because he wasn't the kind of man who took prisoners. Because he had killed enough people in his life and didn't need another ghost haunting him. But none of those answers felt true enough. He ran a hand over his face. Hell, if I know, he admitted. Maybe I just didn't want to be the kind of man who could look at someone in chains and walk away. Naira considered that for a long moment. Then, to Kai's complete surprise, she smiled. Not the small, fleeting, near smile he had seen before. Not the polite, guarded expressions she had learned to mimic. A real honest-to-God smile. Kai's heart did something strange in his chest. Something he wasn't prepared for. Naira looked back at the stars. I think you were a good man before the war. Kai Mercer. Kai swallowed. His throat felt tight. He had been called a lot of things in his life. Commander. Soldier. Killer. But good. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He cleared his throat. You must be tired. Naira gave him a knowing look. Are you? Kai smirked, pushing himself off the railing. Go get some rest. Nira. We've got work to do in the Starrise. She didn't argue. Instead, she stood, moving with more ease than he had ever seen from her. As she passed him, she stopped just long enough to place a hand on his arm. A brief touch. A silent thank you. Then she disappeared into the ship. Kai let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked back at the stars, feeling ceiling, something shift in his chest. Something dangerous. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Kai Mercer had survived a war, but he wasn't sure he was prepared for whatever the hell this was. Kai Mercer had been in plenty of fights before. Some were planned, most violent, and nearly all ended with him, either bleeding, cursing, or both. This was no exception. Blaster fire ripped through the docking bay, flashing against metal crates and leaving the air thick with the acrid scent of burning carbon. Kai ducked behind a supply container, breath sharp, shoulder already throbbing from a fresh wound. Naira crouched beside him, her fingers tightening around the sidearm she had pulled from his emergency stash. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't even breathing hard. Kai had stopped wondering when she learned to handle herself like this. Some things weren't taught. They were survived. "Damn, recognized me," she murmured, eyes flicking toward the enemy position. Kai clenched his jaw. Yeah. There were at least 6 of them. Zarthon mercs, judging by their armor. They had been waiting. That meant someone had tipped them off. That meant this wasn't just bad luck. Someone wanted her back. Kai checked his ammo. Not much left. We need to move. They're trying to box us in. Naira's grip on the blaster tightened, but she nodded. No hesitation. No fear. Kai wasn't sure if that comforted him or scared him. Another shot blasted past. Too close. The heat of it seared against his skin. Kai gritted his teeth and fired 2 quick shots. Then grabbed Naira's wrist. Ron. They sprinted toward the ship, boots slamming against the metal floor, dodging between crates as blaster bolts rained down around them. The docking ramp was open. Their escape in reach. Shot rang out. Pain exploded through Kai's shoulder. The impact sent him staggering. His balance thrown. His vision flickered white. Hot with agony. Naira didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, slung it over her shoulder, and hauled him toward the ship. She was smaller than him, but she was strong. Stronger than she looked. Stronger than she should be. Kai barely felt his feet hit the ramp before they were inside. The ship's doors slammed shut behind them. Kai stumbled forward, landing hard against the nearest bulkhead. Breath ragged. "Stay still," Nira ordered. He didn't argue. He just watched as she grabbed the med kit, yanked his jacket down off his injured arm, and pressed a cauterizing patch to the wound. Kai sucked in a sharp breath through his teeth. "Hell, don't be dramatic," Nira muttered. But her voice was strained. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the bandage. Kai noticed. He smirked, trying to lighten the mood. "You're shaking." Naira's silver eyes snapped to his. "You were shot." Kai blinked. He hadn't expected that much fire behind her words. Naira exhaled sharply and pressed her palms against his chest. "Not gently. You're reckless," she muttered, more to herself than him. Kai felt the warmth of her hands even through his shirt. He felt the way her breath hitched, the way her fingers curled slightly against the fabric. Something in the air shifted. His heartbeat, already pounding from adrenaline, took on a different rhythm. Naira's hands lingered longer than necessary. Her breathing was still uneven. Not from exertion, but from something else. Kai swallowed hard. She looked up at him, and then she kissed him. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't soft. It was desperate, filled with something raw and unspoken. Something neither of them had been willing to name until now. Kai barely had time to process it before she pulled back. Eyes wide. Breath unsteady. He didn't let her finish. His hands slid behind her neck, fingers tangling in her hair. And he pulled her back in. This time it was deeper. Slower. Less about urgency. More about claiming something that had been building between them for far too long. Naira shuddered against him, her hands fisting in his shirt. Kai felt the heat of her body, the way she pressed against him like she was afraid to let go. He had kissed plenty of women before. This was not the same. This was a surrender. Not just hers. His. Kai finally broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. His breath was heavy, his pulse roaring in his ears. Naira's hands were still clutching his shirt like she wasn't ready to step away. Her silver eyes searched his face, her expression torn between fear and something deeper. Kai lifted a hand, brushing his thumb over her cheek. "You okay?" Naira let out a shaky breath, then nodded. Kai smirked. "Good. Because I'm probably going to kiss you again." Her lips parted slightly, her breath catching. Then she smiled. And hell, if that didn't wreck him more than the damn blaster wound. Kai Mercer had always been a man in motion. War had trained him to keep moving, to never get comfortable, to treat every place as temporary and every moment as borrowed time. But now, as he sat in the dim glow of the ship's cockpit, watching the stars blur into streaks of light, he realized something had changed. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about where he needed to run next. Because this time, he wasn't running alone. Behind him, Naira moved through the small space with an ease she hadn't had before. She wasn't hesitant anymore. Wasn't measuring every step like she expected, the ground to vanish beneath her feet. She belonged here, even if she didn't realize it yet. Kai turned his chair slightly, watching as she worked on the ship's navigation console. "Don't think I've ever seen anyone enjoy fixing my messes this much." Naira didn't look up. "I wouldn't enjoy it if you weren't so terrible at maintenance." Kai smirked. "That's fair." She made a small adjustment to the system, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The flickering warning light that had been bothering Kai for weeks finally faded to a steady green. "There," she said, stepping back. "Your engine won't explode." Kai leaned back in his chair. Shame was hoping for a little excitement. Naira shook her head, but the corner of her mouth twitched. Kai studied her for a long moment. The bruises that had once darkened her skin were almost gone. The tension that had kept her shoulders tight had eased. She still carried the weight of her past, but she no longer let it crush her. He cleared his throat. "So, what now?" Naira hesitated. That same flicker of uncertainty, but not fear. She crossed her arms, looking at the stars outside the viewport. "I don't know." Kai let the silence stretch before he said, "You could stay." She turned to him, silver eyes searching his face. "And if I do?" Kai exhaled. He had never been good at talking about things that mattered. But for her, he'd try. "You've been looking over my ship like you own the damn thing," he said, keeping his voice light. "Would be a shame to let all that effort go to waste." Naira arched an eyebrow. "That's your offer?" "Free labor." Kai shrugged. "That. And I'd rather not have to replace my mechanic and my co-pilot." She blinked. "Co-pilot Kai Mittergaze. You've got nowhere to go. I don't have anywhere I want to be. Figure we can make something out of that." Naira was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. Kai smirked. "That, yes," she rolled her eyes. But he saw the way her fingers brushed the console beside her. A quiet acceptance of something she hadn't let herself hope for. "It's a yes," she said softly. Kai let out a slow breath, something in his chest settling. He stood, closing the distance between them. Naira didn't back away. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting him halfway. Kai reached up, brushing a loose strand of silver hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her skin, warm and steady. "You're not a prisoner anymore," he murmured. "You never have to be again." Naira exhaled, and for the first time it sounded like relief. Kai leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers, his hands resting at her waist. She let him hold her there, solid and real. "You're sure about this?" he asked. Naira's hands slid up his arms, resting against his chest. "Are you?" Kai smirked. "I don't do things halfway." Naira's lips curved slightly. Neither do I. She kissed him. Slow this time. To liberate. A choice made freely. Kai pulled her closer, deepening it, letting the moment settle into something undeniable. When they finally broke apart, Kai rested his chin against the top of her head, his arms still wrapped around her. "Oh," he murmured. "Where to?" Co-pilot. Nira tilted her head slightly, looking out at the endless expanse of stars. "Anyway," she said. "Everywhere." Kai grinned. Sounds like a plan. And for the first time in his life, he actually meant it. Kai Mercer had never believed in fate. He believed in choices, in action, in the simple reality that the universe didn't owe anyone a damned thing. But as he stood in the ship's cockpit, watching the incoming transmission blink on the console, he had to wonder if the universe had a sense of humor after all. Naira sat beside him in the co-pilot seat, legs tucked under her, silver hair falling loose over her shoulder. She was running diagnostics on the ship's systems, fingers moving effortlessly across the controls. She had made the chair hers in a way Kai hadn't expected. Like she belonged there. Like she had always belonged there. She didn't look up. "Are you going to answer it?" Kai exhaled through his nose, rubbing his thumb over the edge of the console. The transmission had been pinging them for the last 10 minutes. It was a priority message. From an old contact in the Galactic Reclamation Union. "I know who it's from," he muttered. Naira glanced at him, and Kai hesitated. He had spent years following orders, fighting battles for people who sat safely behind reinforced walls while soldiers like him bled for their decisions. He had walked away from that life, left it in the ashes of war. But now they were calling him back. He could ignore it. He could cut the transmission, take Naira and the ship and disappear into the stars. No one could make him go back. But he already knew he wouldn't. Naira must have read something in his expression because she straightened. "You're thinking about answering?" Kai huffed a laugh. "Thinking about it." She studied him for a moment, then leaned back, crossing her arms. "You don't owe them anything." Kai knew that. But it wasn't about them. "You're calling because they need something," he said. "And if they need me, it means it's bad." Sale's gaze was steady, so Kai let the silence stretch between them before he answered, "I can't just pretend I don't care." That was the truth of it. He had spent so long trying to be done with war, done with fighting. But when it came down to it, he wasn't the kind of man who could walk away when people needed him. Naira's expression didn't change, but he saw the understanding in her eyes. She had been trapped for so long, forced into choices she hadn't been allowed to make. Kai had freed her from that, and now he was facing his own moment of decision. Finally, she nodded. "Then let's answer it." Kai felt something shift in his chest. Something warm. Something steady. He reached over and activated the transmission. A familiar face flickered to life on the screen. Captain Wren Hale, his old commanding officer. She looked older, more tired than he remembered. "Grayson," she said, exhaling like she wasn't sure he would pick up. "I was starting to think you really had disappeared." Kai smirked. "Still here." "For now?" Hale's gaze flicked to Sale, curiosity flashing across her face. But she didn't ask. Instead, she got straight to the point. "Need you. There's something moving in the outer systems. Something big." Kai exchanged a glass with Naira before turning back to the screen. "Define big." "Hale hesitated." "We're still piecing it together. But whatever it is, it's targeting survivors of the war. People like her." "Nira still." Kai clenched his jaw. "Zarthan, no." Hale said. "Something else?" The silence stretched long and heavy. Kai could feel Naira watching him, waiting. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about her. Kai exhaled and sat forward. Send me the details. Hale nodded. Understood. And Kai, it's good to see you again. The screen went dark. Kai leaned back, running a hand through his hair. He let the weight of the decision settle before speaking. You don't have to do this. Nero tiltar head. Neither do you. Kai let out a breathless laugh. Guess we're both bad at running away. Naira reached out, taking his hand. Her fingers curled around his placen. Warm and steady. Then let's stop pretending we're trying. Kai looked at her. The woman who had once been a prisoner, now his partner, his co-pilot, his choice. He squeezed her hand. All right. Then let's go. He fired up the engines, the ship rumbling beneath them as they turned toward the unknown. Not running, not escaping, choosing. Together,